Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we walk past without ever knowing the truth. Tonight, you'll meet a man once dismissed as just another old veteran, until his forgotten invention changed the course of naval history. Stay with us, because by the end, you'll see why silence can be the loudest legacy. The camera opens on a bustling modern shipyard simulation center. Young officers, crisp in uniform, stand before screens filled with digital maps and glowing navigation systems. Among them, leaning quietly against a railing, is Commander James Whitaker, a retired Navy officer well into his 70s. His weathered hands hold a small leather pouch, worn smooth by decades of use. The younger recruits glance at him, some with respect, others with impatience. Technology has replaced tradition, and to them James seems like a relic of a past era. One officer whispers, "Why is he even here? This isn't the 1960s anymore." James doesn't react. Instead, his fingers brush against the object inside the pouch, a custom mapping tool he designed long ago during a high-stakes naval operation. The faint creak of the leather and the smell of seawater memory seem to transport him back to another time. The exercise begins. The younger navigators fumble with data overload, struggling to keep pace with the unexpected variables in the simulation. Currents shift, weather models distort, and the digital systems begin to glitch. Their frustration grows. James watches silently. His eyes narrow, not with judgment, but with recognition. He has seen this kind of chaos before, not on a screen, but on a storm-tossed deck in the middle of a critical mission. The story that will unfold is not one of combat, but of courage, sacrifice, and ingenuity. A story hidden behind the quiet dignity of a man underestimated by those who have never walked in his shoes. This is the journey of the forgotten navigator, a tale of invisible heroism, a symbolic tool, and the timeless truth that innovation often begins with necessity and humility. The simulation room buzzed with controlled urgency. Young officers adjusted their headsets, eyes darting across bright monitors. The exercise was designed to test adaptability under pressure, but for them, it also became a chance to prove superiority, especially with an old guest in the room. Commander Whitaker's presence was tolerated, not welcomed. He stood with quiet dignity, back straight, gaze calm. To the recruits, he looked like an artifact in a museum, polished, but irrelevant. "Sir," said Lieutenant Carter, a tall, confident officer leading the drill, "you're welcome to observe, but please understand, this is a different Navy than the one you knew." The remark drew chuckles from a few others. Carter pressed further, "We're not plotting with compasses anymore. We've got satellites, predictive AI. The game has changed." James gave no reply. Instead, he let his fingers trace the edge of the pouch at his side. Silence can be a stronger answer than words. Only one young ensign, Miller, seemed uncomfortable with the mockery. He watched the older man closely, noting not weakness but presence, a steadiness that contrasted with the hurried confidence of his peers. The exercise escalated. Waves of simulated data poured across screens. Coordinates shifted, radar feeds blurred. Carter barked orders, his tone sharp but uncertain. Within minutes, the system began to falter under pressure. "Reboot the feed," someone shouted. "Adjust the course models," another insisted. Panic seeped into their voices. In the corner, James adjusted his stance. His gaze sharpened, eyes moving not with confusion but calculation. Though no one noticed, he was already mapping the chaos in his mind, tracing currents and angles invisible to the digital systems. But to the young officers, he remained nothing more than an outdated spectator. Until, of course, the moment came when silence could no longer hide truth. The storm inside the simulation worsened. Numbers blinked, maps distorted, and the room filled with clipped commands. To the young officers, it was an exercise in frustration. To Commander James Whitaker, it was a memory resurfacing. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. The hum of servers in the shipyard seemed to transform into something else. The deep, bone-shaking vibration of an engine room at sea. The faint metallic rattle of tools in the training center became, in his mind, the clatter of chains striking steel decks, and the air-conditioned chill. It shifted into the biting salt spray of the Atlantic. James could almost smell it again, that sharp mixture of diesel, rust, and seawater that never leaves the skin. His body swayed slightly, instinctively compensating for a roll of the deck that wasn't there. Decades ago, he had stood in a cramped navigation room, the storm raging outside. The map spread before him had blurred with moisture, the ink running. The early radar equipment crackled, unreliable, nearly useless. His young team looked to him then, desperate for certainty. He remembered the silence in that room, the kind of silence that doesn't calm but sharpens, every man waiting for him to draw the next line. "We're off the charts, Commander," a voice from the past whispered in his memory. "No system can track this storm." And that's when James had reached for the tool he had built with his own hands. A peculiar creation, born from necessity. A device that seemed archaic, even then, but worked when nothing else could. Back in the present, his thumb rubbed against the outline of the pouch once more. He said nothing, though the memories pressed against him with the weight of waves. Ensign Miller, noticing his distant gaze, stepped closer. "Sir?" he asked quietly, hesitant to interrupt. James turned to him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the older man considered saying nothing, but then he offered a fragment, his voice low, almost like a confession. "Storms don't always follow the maps you're given. Sometimes, you have to make your own." Miller blinked, unsure whether it was metaphor or literal truth. Before he could ask more, Lieutenant Carter snapped at him. "Miller, focus on the simulation, not on bedtime stories." The younger officers laughed, though Miller didn't join them. He stole one last glance at James, who had already shifted back into silence. The storm on the screens intensified, the digital projection lurching dangerously close to simulated disaster. Panic rippled across the room. But James remained still, listening not to the machines, but to something deeper. The echoes of storms survived, the rhythm of seas crossed, the lessons written not in manuals, but in memory. For him, the simulation was not chaos, it was déjà vu, and soon they would realize the difference between data and wisdom. The simulation room vibrated with frustration. Officers barked half-formed orders at one another, fingers racing over keyboards. The storm on the screens twisted into chaos, currents pulling the virtual fleet into peril, projections glitching and failing under the strain. Lieutenant Carter slammed his fist on the console. "Systems down again. We can't hold the course like this." His voice carried both anger and embarrassment. This was supposed to showcase their precision, their superiority. Instead, the simulation was exposing cracks. And then, for the first time that day, Commander James Whitaker moved. He unfastened the flap of his worn leather pouch with a soft, deliberate motion. The sound, a faint creak of aged leather, seemed louder than the chaos around them. Slowly, he withdrew an object that caught the eye of the only person still watching him closely. Ensign Miller. It was unlike anything the young officer had seen before. A strange, handcrafted device, shaped like a compass but fitted with sliding rulers, fine engravings, and delicate notches worn smooth by time. Brass glinted faintly under the fluorescent lights, dulled by years of salt and touch. Miller leaned in, whispering, "Sir, what is that?" James held it with reverence, his thumb brushing across a carved marking near its edge. A small star etched by hand. His voice came low, steady, and measured. "It's a navigator's truth. Built it myself when nothing else worked. Saved more than ships. It saved futures." Miller's brow furrowed. "Futures?" he wanted to ask, but Carter's sharp voice cut through again. Spotting the object in James's hand, Carter scoffed. "You've got to be kidding me. A toy compass? That's your answer to this storm?" Laughter broke out among some of the younger officers. "Sir, with respect, we're running 21st century simulations, not pirate voyages." James did not flinch at the ridicule. Instead, he lifted the tool higher, his eyes calm but piercing. His words carried the weight of someone who had no need to prove himself, only to state fact. When your machines choke on too much information, you need something that doesn't choke at all. Miller, despite Carter's mockery, stepped closer, studying the device. The engravings fascinated him, the subtle curves and calculations etched into brass and wood. This was no relic. It was purposeful, meticulous, alive with stories untold. "Does it really work?" Miller asked softly. James gave the faintest of smiles. "It has worked when nothing else could." The room grew tense again as the simulation blared alarms, the digital storm driving the fleet toward failure. Carter barked at his team to regain control, but the panic in his tone betrayed him. Meanwhile, James's steady hand rested over the tool. He had not yet offered to intervene, nor had he demanded attention. But the simple act of revealing it, of letting its quiet authority speak for itself, planted a seed of doubt in the room. For the first time, Miller wasn't the only one wondering if this old man's toy carried more truth than the brightest of their screens. The storm inside the simulation chamber had reached its breaking point. The fleet of digital vessels now spun off course, battered by artificial winds and distorted projections. The system alarms echoed in sharp tones, filling the room with tension. Officers scrambled, shouting conflicting orders as the simulation chart bled red warnings. Lieutenant Carter's voice cut through the chaos, but not with control, only with frustration. "Recalibrate the models. Override the system lag. We're losing the fleet." But the young officers knew it was futile. Every command brought more glitches, more miscalculations. Their high-tech advantage was collapsing in real time. In the corner, Commander James Whitaker stood silently, the brass of his handcrafted mapping tool catching the faintest glimmer of light. His expression was steady, his breathing calm, while the storm of panic swirled around him. Ensign Miller glanced between Carter and Whitaker, torn between obedience and instinct. He noticed the difference. Carter's commands were frantic, Whitaker's silence, composed. Finally, James spoke, not loudly, but with the authority of someone who had once commanded men in life or death moments. "Your fleet is already lost on that screen." The room froze for a second. Carter whipped around, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" James stepped forward, the leather pouch now tucked under his arm, the custom tool firm in his hand. His voice was calm, but unwavering. "You're fighting the system, not the sea. That's why you're failing. The ocean doesn't care for algorithms. It listens only to truth." Carter laughed harshly, though the edge of doubt crept into his tone. "Truth? We're running advanced simulations, Commander, not fairy tales. We don't need relics waving compasses at screens." But Miller wasn't laughing. He studied James's tool, the engravings precise, the mechanics purposeful. Something in the older man's presence carried a gravity that no flashing screen could match. As Carter ordered another system reboot, the projection jolted violently. The simulated fleet was seconds from catastrophic failure. Officers looked to Carter, their confidence in him unraveling. James raised the tool slightly, his voice cutting through the panic like a steady bell. "There's a way through, I can guide it." The room went still. Carter bristled, jaw tightening. "You think you can solve this with that antique? Fine. Prove it. But when it fails, you'll sit down and stay out of the way." James didn't rise to the challenge with bravado. Instead, he nodded once, almost reverently, and stepped closer to the console. He placed the mapping tool gently on the table, its brass edges glowing under the sterile light. Miller leaned forward, curiosity written across his face. Carter folded his arms, waiting to see the inevitable failure. But James wasn't panicked, nor hurried. He adjusted the sliders, aligned the etched star with a marked curve, and traced invisible lines across the storm data. His hand was steady, his eyes sharp, like a man who had done this not in simulation, but in storms where the next decision determined survival. "You've been chasing the waves," he said, voice low but firm. "What you need is to listen to their rhythm." The room, once chaotic, grew silent as the old navigator began to work. The silence in the simulation chamber was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of James Whitaker's tool as he adjusted its sliders and notches with deliberate precision. The young officers watched with unease, their earlier smirks fading into reluctant curiosity. Even Lieutenant Carter, arms crossed and jaw tight, leaned forward without realizing it. James traced a line across the glowing digital projection, his brass device held against the screen as though it belonged there more than any algorithm ever could. His voice, steady and measured, carried into the room. When storms rise, the sea teaches you to read it, not fight it. Technology doesn't fail because it is weak. It fails because it forgets the rhythm of nature. As his hand moved, the projection recalibrated. The simulated ships, once caught in spirals of error, began to align with his calculated course. The chaos on the screen softened into patterns, predictable, almost elegant. Miller's eyes widened. "He's correcting the simulation," Carter muttered, half in disbelief. "Impossible." But James wasn't focused on their astonishment. His gaze drifted, beyond the room, beyond the screen, into memory. The training center dissolved in his mind, replaced by the howling storm of decades past. He was back on the bridge of a Navy ship, waves towering like walls of liquid steel. Radar feeds flickered uselessly, their data scrambled by the storm. The navigation charts were soaked, edges curling in his hands. His crew looked at him then, not with skepticism but desperation. "Commander, we've lost all bearings. What do we do?" One voice cried through the wind. James had reached for the very same tool now in his hand. The brass had been wet, salt biting into his fingers, but the device had not failed him. Aligning it against a trembling lantern's light, he traced their path with calm precision, cutting through panic with the clarity of certainty. He remembered the silence after he gave the order, the engines shifting course, the ship groaning as it turned into the storm's rhythm instead of against it. Hours later, when dawn broke, the fleet had emerged battered, but alive. No medals had been pinned for that night. No headlines had carried the story. The operation remained classified, known only to those aboard. But the truth was simple. Without that tool, without that man, futures would have been lost. The flash of memory faded. James was back in the simulation room, his tool still steady, his voice calm. "I built this because I had no choice. Machines failed me once. Men depended on me, and I could not let them down." The simulated fleet now followed a smooth trajectory, safe from the digital storm. The alarms dimmed, replaced by stunned silence. Miller stared at James with awe, his chest tight with respect. Carter, pale with disbelief, struggled to form words. For the first time, the room truly saw Commander Whitaker, not as a relic but as a man who once carried the invisible weight of lives, guided only by courage, ingenuity, and a handmade truth. The room was hushed. The glowing screens now showed stability, the simulated storm brought under control by calculations drawn not from satellites or AI, but from a brass device crafted by human hands decades earlier. Ensign Miller whispered almost reverently, "He saved the fleet." Lieutenant Carter's jaw worked, his pride battling against the truth before him. It's just luck," he muttered, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Before he could say more, the double doors of the chamber opened with a sharp hiss. Into the room stepped Admiral Hayes, the senior officer overseeing the training exercises. His presence immediately straightened spines and silenced whispers. The man's silver insignia glimmered as he walked with deliberate weight, his eyes scanning the room. "Report," Hayes commanded. Carter stepped forward quickly, eager to regain composure. "Sir, the simulation faced a complete system failure. We attempted recalibration, but..." Hayes raised a hand, silencing him, his gaze already fixed on James Whitaker. For a long moment, the Admiral simply stared, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he spoke. "I know that face." A ripple of confusion spread through the younger officers. Carter blinked. "Sir?" Hayes stepped closer to James, his voice carrying both recognition and respect. "Commander James Whitaker, navigator of the North Atlantic operations. You're the man who designed the contingency mapping device, classified innovation still in restricted archives. Gasps whispered across the room. Miller's eyes widened in awe. Carter's composure shattered. Hayes continued, his voice firm but tinged with reverence. That device, he gestured to the tool in James's hand, prevented an entire fleet from being lost. I read the report myself. It never reached the newspapers, but inside the Navy we knew. Your ingenuity turned chaos into survival. The Admiral turned to the young officers, his gaze sharp. And yet here you stand, mocking the very man whose quiet invention still influences the systems you rely on. Without him, some of us might not even be standing here today. Silence filled the chamber. Carter's face flushed crimson, his arrogance stripped bare. Miller, on the other hand, straightened with pride, as though sharing in the honor of the revelation. James did not bask in the recognition. He stood as he always had, quiet, humble, his hand resting gently on the pouch. His eyes did not seek applause, only understanding. Hayes, sensing this humility, placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder. The Navy remembers, Commander. Even when the world forgets. The weight of those words lingered in the air. For the first time, every officer in the room looked at James not as an artifact, but as a living legacy, a man whose silent courage had shaped their very future. And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. The forgotten navigator had never been forgotten by the sea, or by those who truly understood honor. The chamber remained quiet long after Admiral Hayes had spoken. The weight of truth hung heavy, pressing down harder than any storm. The young officers shifted uneasily, avoiding James Whitaker's gaze. Lieutenant Carter, who had been the loudest in his dismissal, now stood rigid, his face pale with embarrassment. His earlier confidence seemed shattered, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own pride. Admiral Hayes stepped aside, allowing the silence to do its work. The only sound was the soft hum of the stabilized simulation, and the faint ticking of James's brass device as it rested in his hand. Finally, Carter took a slow step forward. His voice, usually sharp with command, was quieter now, edged with humility. Commander, I was wrong. The words felt heavy, dragged out of him with effort. He cleared his throat and tried again, more firmly. I disrespected you. I dismissed what I didn't understand, and I let pride blind me. For that, I apologize. The young officers watched in stunned silence. For them, seeing Carter, always so sure of himself, offer such words was almost unthinkable. James regarded him calmly, his expression unreadable. Then, after a pause, he spoke in that same steady voice that seemed to carry the tide itself. Humility is a stronger compass than pride, Lieutenant. The sea has a way of teaching that lesson. Sometimes gently, sometimes not. Carter lowered his head, visibly chastened. But before the weight of shame could overwhelm him, James continued, What matters is that you learn. We all serve not for ourselves, but for those who come after us. Remember that. The words lifted some of the heaviness, transforming shame into reflection. Carter nodded, his eyes glistening with the first spark of true respect. Ensign Miller, who had quietly admired James from the start, stepped forward eagerly. His voice carried both reverence and hope. Commander Whitaker, would you teach me? Not just the device, but the way you read the sea? The way you see patterns where others see chaos? For the first time that day, James allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. He extended the brass tool, holding it out carefully. The device gleamed under the lights, but in his hand it looked less like metal and more like a piece of living history. This is just an instrument, James said softly. It doesn't hold the truth. The truth lies here. He tapped his temple, then his chest. And here. Tools change. Technology changes. But courage, clarity, and humility, those never become obsolete. Miller accepted the device with both hands, as though receiving something sacred. His face carried not only excitement, but also a newfound sense of responsibility. Around the room, the younger officers straightened, their skepticism replaced by quiet respect. The mocking laughter that had once filled the chamber was gone. In its place was something heavier, something purer, honor. And for the first time, Commander James Whitaker was no longer invisible to them. He was their teacher, their elder, their compass. The simulation room, once buzzing with arrogance and doubt, had shifted into an almost sacred quiet. The brass tool now rested in Ensign Miller's hands, its weight far heavier than metal alone. He held it as if it contained not only equations and engravings, but also unseen stories. Storms survived, lives saved, sacrifices unspoken. Commander James Whitaker stood before them, not as a relic of history, but as a living testament to the values the Navy cherished most: courage, honor, humility. His voice carried a calm authority that needed no rank to command respect. "Machines will always grow faster, smarter, sharper," he began, his gaze sweeping across the young officers. "But they will never replace the one thing that decides survival, the heart of the navigator. Technology is only as strong as the one who guides it." Miller listened intently, his eyes fixed on James as though trying to absorb every word. Even Carter, who only hours before had dismissed the veteran, now stood with his arms at his side, head lowered, the defiance gone. James stepped closer to Miller, gently adjusting the young man's grip on the device. "It's not about the tool itself. It's about seeing what others overlook, about keeping calm when the storm roars, about knowing that sometimes the smallest act of clarity can preserve the future of many." He tapped the brass edge once more, then let go. "This was mine, but its purpose is not to sit in a pouch. It belongs with those willing to listen, to the sea, to the silence, to the truth." Miller swallowed hard, his voice almost trembling. "I'll honor it, sir, I promise." James gave a faint nod. "Then you will not just navigate ships, you will navigate men, and that is the greater calling." A hush settled over the room as the weight of his words sank in. No screen could have taught them that lesson. No simulation could have revealed it. It had taken the humility of one forgotten navigator to remind them that technology without wisdom is nothing more than noise. Admiral Hayes, who had watched the exchange in silence, finally spoke. His voice was solemn, but proud. "Let this be the true lesson of today's exercise. Not in how to outwit a storm, but in how to recognize the strength of those who came before us. The future of this Navy depends not only on innovation, but on legacy." The officers stood taller now, not because of pride, but because they had been reminded of something deeper than themselves. For James, the moment was not about recognition. It was about passing forward what mattered most. In Miller's hands, the tool gleamed, not as an antique but as a living torch. And as the young officers looked upon the veteran, their eyes carried not condescension, but reverence. The forgotten navigator was forgotten no more. The next morning, the storm simulation was already a memory, but its lesson lingered. At a quiet coastal diner, away from the screens and uniforms, Commander James Whitaker sat at a small corner table. The sun filtered through salt-stained windows, casting a warm glow across the wood. He stirred his coffee slowly, the steam rising like a soft echo of the seas he once sailed. Around him, life carried on. Families laughed over breakfast. Fishermen swapped stories at the counter, and no one paid particular attention to the older man with weathered hands, and that was exactly how James preferred it. His life had never been about recognition. It had always been about duty, sacrifice, and silence. Then the door opened. Ensign Miller walked in, still in uniform, his posture more resolute than the day before. In his hands was the leather pouch, worn but now polished with reverence. He approached James's table quietly, placing the pouch beside him. The two men exchanged no grand words, no formal ceremony, just a nod, an unspoken understanding that the past and future of navigation, of service, of honor, had found their bridge. James raised his cup in a subtle toast. Miller mirrored the gesture. Outside, waves broke gently against the shore, their rhythm eternal. The lesson had been passed on, not with medals or speeches, but with humility and truth. For those who witnessed it, the forgotten navigator was no longer invisible, and for those who never would, his legacy still lived, quiet, steadfast, unyielding. True heroism is not measured in recognition, but in the futures it quietly preserves. If you believe stories like Commander Whitaker's deserve to be remembered, honor his legacy. Like this video, share it, and subscribe, so that together we ensure no veteran sacrifice, no courage, and no truth ever remain invisible.